AdvoKAYte, holding healthcare accountable. This podcast is my way of sharing what I've learned about the mistakes, the cover-ups, and the ways we can all protect ourselves. We're all in this together. Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of AdvoKAYte, holding healthcare accountable. I'm thrilled today to have my friend, Dr. Robert Oshel, as our guest, a.k.a. Bob to me. Bob, thanks for joining us.
Oh, I'm glad to be here.
So, Dr. Robert Oshel, Bob, tell us a little bit about yourself. What kind of a doctor are you?
Well, I'm a PhD doctor, not a medical doctor. And my PhD is in government and with a specialization in research methodology and public law, which means the public law part means I took courses in the law school along with law students, but not to become a lawyer, but to understand how the legal system works.
Well, I've always said you're one of the smartest people that I know, and now I'm convinced because you decided to not become a doctor or a lawyer. So you and I came to know one another 20 years ago or so through your work at Public Citizen. But prior to that, you were with the National Practitioner Data Bank for many years. Can you talk to us about that?
Sure. The National Practitioner Data Bank is a system that receives reports of malpractice payments, clinical privileges, actions taken against physicians by hospitals or managed care organizations, and licensure actions. And I was hired in 1993 to set up a research program for the data bank. It opened in 1990, and they thought by 3 years later they would have enough data to make it worthwhile for research. And so that's what I did. And then later they asked me to also take over supervision of the secretarial review process, which is the process for a quasi-judicial review of disputed reports. If a physician or someone else is reported and they don't think the report's accurate or that it should have been reported at all, then they can dispute the report. We would do an analysis of whether it was required and whether it was accurate, and then make a decision and either change the report, delete the report, or uphold the report as submitted.
And your role with the data bank was more of a director level position, right?
Yes.
And then,
in charge of the secretarial review and in charge of the research program. Initially, the research program was a one-man band, and that was expanded. And of course, the secretarial review process also included analysts, lawyers. We could get medical help when we needed it, and so on. So, we'll both be dating ourselves here, but I want you to talk about what Public Citizen is and who founded that many, many years ago, which most people today might not even know who that is. But I want you to talk about Public Citizen a little bit and how you began to work with them. Well, Public Citizen is a nonprofit public interest group, I guess you could say. And it was founded by Ralph Nader. Yeah. And the health research group was established with it by Dr. Sidney Wolfe. And, they advocated for patient safety. And one of the things they would do is ask us at the data bank for information. Of course, the law limits what the data bank can publish. We can't release anything to the public that names individual physicians or other practitioners, but we could release statistical information. So, they would ask for information and use it to help them draft reports that hopefully would improve patient safety, maybe through legislation or in other ways. And I thought that was a pretty good thing to be done with our data, and help them to the extent that I could while I was there. When I retired, then I volunteered at Public Citizen to basically do what the research half of my job was, at least in part, at the data bank, and that was to analyze the data that was publicly available. We made a public use file available to anyone that wanted to download it that had information from every report in the data bank so that analysis could be done. You couldn't identify individuals, but you could look at malpractice payment trends, hospital disciplinary action trends, and so on with that data. And that's what I've been doing ever since.
And that's actually when you and I met. I mean, literally, I know it's been at least 20 years ago, but I first met your colleague Al Levine, who's sadly no longer with us. Sidney Wolf's no longer with
No
us.
longer with us.
I don't know what Ralph Nader's doing these days, but you know, I want to talk about, first of all, your work at the data bank, and let's go into a little bit of more detail about what the data bank is. So you joined the data bank in 93. We know that was probably about 8 years after Congress created it, correct?
Right.
And
Yeah, the act was passed in 1986, and the data bank actually opened on September 1, 1990. So it took them, a good period of time to develop this computer system to do it. And, this is back in the early days of computers. So there was a lot of programming and setting up that needed to be done. So they started receiving reports in late 1990 of all malpractice payments that are for physicians or any other licensed healthcare practitioner in the United States, all licensure actions taken against a physician, a dentist, any other licensed, not initially any other, but it came to be all kinds of licensed healthcare practitioners, clinical privileges actions taken by hospitals and HMOs, and it was expanded to a few other kinds of things, like Office of Inspector General, debarments from participation in Medicare and Medicaid and all of that. And so other kinds of things as well. But malpractice payments, licensure actions, clinical privileges actions have always been the big ones. And the data then was collected to be available to hospitals, to licensure bodies that were going to license or put a physician or another kind of practitioner on their panel or to hire them. And so they could see if anybody had a problem in their record. This was established because there had been a problem with physicians, getting in malpractice problem or having licensure issues, say, in California, moving to New York, and not telling New York's licensing board about the problems they had in California or the malpractice issues they had, or not telling a hospital where they were applying for privileges about the problems they had. And so, Congress decided that some system of collecting this data nationally was necessary so that licensing boards, hospitals, and so on could be sure that they were getting complete information about whoever was applying.
And so, the system seemed to be designed pretty beautifully because it was a way where the people that had the information, that would be medical boards, hospitals, professional liability insurance carriers, and the like, could and were required by law to report to a confidential database. And they couldn't, a lawyer couldn't come after them and say, oh, I want to subpoena this. You reported. What did you report? When did you report it? But it was to help them partially. Like, if a medical board's deciding to give a doctor a license in a particular state, this is a place where they could go and they could know that the data was good, or a hospital to say, well, hold on, I want to know what other hospitals you've had privileges at, if you had any problems there. And so as it was designed, it was great. But as you and I know all too well, from the get-go, there began to be questions about the integrity of the data bank's data because hospitals were not following the law.
Well, yeah, I mean, that is a problem. There are loopholes in reporting and enforcement problems as well. There are ways to, avoid taking a clinical privileges action if you've got a problem physician, and perhaps under the table agree with them that they'll resign their clinical privileges and move elsewhere if we don't start an investigation. Well, technically under the law, that's reportable, but there's no way for the data bank to know that it's happening. And there are other loopholes like that, that cause problems for reporting malpractice payments or clinical privileges actions. Licensure actions are pretty well reported when they're taken, but it's a problem that the incentives for a hospital are, we don't want to have to report. They love to get the information, but they don't want to have to report it if they can find a way to avoid it.
Which, I wish hospitals could understand that they're shooting themselves in the foot because, my dad always used to say, I'm from Oklahoma. My dad always used to say, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And hospitals some hospitals, many hospitals, don't follow the law. They use their own lawyers to try to work around the law. But then what's good for the goose is good for the gander. If the other hospitals are also trying to subvert the rules, then they don't have the data that they need to protect themselves and their patients from a problem doctor.
Sure, that's exactly what happened with the Christopher Duntsch case, for example. Hospitals decided that we need to get rid of this guy because he's dangerous, but they would do it in a way that wasn't reportable, or they simply didn't file a report. So the next hospital that he went to didn't know the full extent of what the problem was.
And, Ann Roberts has talked to us about a lot of this. And, part of the problem is the lawyers that advise the hospitals and the hospital administrators that willingly take that advice and willingly break the law. So let's say, for example, that a doctor has a bunch of complications, and that's raised a red flag, and they're considered to be a problem, dangerous. And the hospital and their lawyers know, well, if we suspend this doctor for 30 days or 31 days or 60 days, that's reportable. The law requires us to report to the data bank. But you know what? If we suspend the doctor for 29 days or 28 days, it's not reportable. So we're going to suspend the doctor for 28 days.
Right.
That's just one example. And this is hurting patients ultimately. This isn't about a statistical gotcha, you're not crossing T's or dotting I's. I mean, this is a direct patient safety catastrophe. I mean, would you agree with that?
Oh, yeah, I would. I mean, it takes an awful lot to get a hospital peer review committee to take an action against one of their colleagues. They don't want to do it unless they really have to. There's, despite the protections built into the law for them participating in peer review, they're still, they can still be sued. They don't have to, they're protected against paying money, civil money damages, but they still have the defense costs. So, it's a problem. They don't want to have to report anyone. And, if it's a physician who's in a specialty that's bringing in a lot of patients or bringing in a lot of money for the hospital in terms of procedures being performed, they don't want to take an action against them because they don't want that physician to take all that money that he's bringing in to the hospital down the street or in the next town.
So if
the
you
incentives are not to report if they can avoid it.
Right. So if you're looking at this as a three-legged stool and you got physician, the hospital's own financial interest, and the patient. Sounds to me like a large number of hospitals are choosing to protect their doctors, their bottom line, and not the patient. Is that fair?
Seems to be the case. Over the 35 years the data bank has been opened, only about half of the hospitals have ever filed a clinical privileges report with the data bank. It's not a common event. In fact, the most reports ever filed, I think, was in 2004. 913 clinical privileges reports were filed. More recently, in 2024, there were 777. Well, compare that to what the AMA itself suggested would happen when the law was being considered back in 1986. They thought there would be 10,000 clinical privileges reports a year. Clearly, it hasn't been anything like that. So, yeah, there's a lot of things that probably ought to be reported that one way or another aren't being reported.
Well, and you've known me long enough and well enough to know that I've got a little sarcastic streak in me, but my sarcastic response was going to be, well, gee, Bob, maybe you've just become jaded. Maybe there's just not that many dangerous doctors out there, and that's why there's so few reports.
Well, yeah, not necessarily. We did a study over a 20-year period of malpractice payments, and we found that 1.8% of all physicians were responsible for half of all the money paid out for malpractice. So you hear about, the horrible amounts we're paying out. We've got a cap patient reimbursement and so on. But only 1.8% of physicians were responsible for half of all the dollars paid out. Well, if you look at those physicians, only 6% of them had ever had any action taken against their clinical privileges in a hospital, and only 11% of them had ever had any action, not even a reprimand, taken against their licensure. So, there's a problem. Not much is being done about it, even for the worst of the worst, that 1.8% responsible for half of all the malpractice dollars, most of whom, by the way, had multiple malpractice payments. It wasn't a case of somebody with one huge payment. It was somebody with a whole series of payments. So the profession could do a lot better in terms of policing itself.
Well, I think that's, probably an understatement to say the least, that if we have an idea that most doctors are well trained, they're sane, they have the patient's best interest at heart, but there's
absolutely,
maybe around 1.8, 2% that aren't, and and we know it. And we also know that it is the hospital's legal, moral, and ethical responsibility to police their own. And the hospitals are in the best position to know who their problem children are, so to speak, because they track things. Like a patient wouldn't know if Dr. A had more surgical infections than patient B, but the hospital darn sure knows. They know who's getting readmitted to the hospital, who's getting reoperated on, who's having postoperative complications, who's having infections. All of these things, they study all of these things. And you're a data guy, and hospitals are mad about collecting their data. But,
Absolutely.
The patient doesn't have access to any of that.
Well, that's correct. The patient doesn't have access. And, to make it worse, if somebody has to come back to the hospital because there was an infection, then the hospital makes more money. Right. So the incentives are perverse.
Yeah.
And the incentives basically are to protect physician who's a problem physician, unless he is so bad that he's causing problems for the hospital's image, basically, or they think there's going to be a legal liability in terms of malpractice if they don't do something about somebody with a really proven bad record. But the incentives are not to take action and not to report. And it's just very unfortunate.
Well, the poor patient, which, by the way, includes you and me and everybody we love and care about, everybody who may be listening to this podcast. So, let's say a patient needed to go to a hospital to have a surgery or something like that. The hospital, and let's say there was 1 out of 50 of their doctors that was a known issue, a known problem, and the hospital knew it. The patient wouldn't have any way to discern how to navigate avoiding that one doctor. And
That's right. I mean, that's part of the problem, and that's part of the problem with the National Practitioner Data Bank as well. I mean, its data is not perfect by any means, but it's the only national system available that collects this kind of data, and it's the best data available, but it's not open to the public. So I can't go in and search to see if the surgeon I need to see about something has a record of malpractice payments or disciplinary actions by the licensing board or hospitals or not. There's no way for me to know because the data isn't published or isn't public. And the only way to change that would be for people to demand that Congress change the law. And that's probably not going to happen because it would be a whole lot of pushback by the AMA and other medical groups.
Well, I do want to talk about that. And you and I have talked about this many times in our ongoing advocacy efforts to get the law changed. But you're right. I mean, I think certainly in our lifetimes, forget about it. That's never going to happen. But, as a patient, I would say if a hospital knows that I'm about to be wheeled into surgery and my surgeon has a alcohol problem, or, I mean, it could be anything else. Just, a problem with maybe doing unnecessary surgeries or creating too many unnecessary complications. I mean, you go in for a hysterectomy and there's one of the doctors that tends to injure the bowel and the patient becomes septic and some of them die. I mean, boy, wouldn't you like to know that as a patient to say, I want to be an informed consumer and I want to avoid that guy or that gal. I'd rather choose the one with the better outcomes. Like if you go to buy a car or a dishwasher or any number of things, you can get a lot of data about like, well, I want to avoid this dishwasher, the motor burned out after a year, or this one didn't cool right after 2 years. But,
Yeah. I've said that you can find out more information about the quality of your toaster than you can find out about the quality of your physician's care.
Yeah.
It's just not publicly available. And it should be because, if you go in through the emergency room, you don't have much of a choice. And you have to rely on the hospital to have competent and caring professionals. Well, 99% of the time, you are going to get somebody who's competent and caring and doesn't have a behavioral problem. But the hospitals need to do a much better job to protect you from the 1 or 2% who are a problem.
Well, and then, sense my sarcasm with this, which I want to say, well, that's easy, Bob. All we have to do is punish the hospitals that are breaking the law. Why don't we just fix the problem that way?
Well, it's easier said than done because the law doesn't really allow the data bank to do much about it. If the hospital is not reporting something that should be reported and the data bank finds out about it, which is a very rare event in the first place, somebody would have to be in effect a whistleblower. Then the data bank ask them about the situation. Well, why didn't you report Dr. X? And they will explain that, well, he wasn't reportable under the law, or that, oh, yeah, we should have filed a report, and we'll go ahead and file the report now. Well, the philosophy at the data bank has always been that we'd rather have a late report than not have a report at all. We don't want to drive these reports underground where they never get reported. So that's one thing. And even if they did want to take an action against a hospital for not reporting, there's a lengthy hearing process, and the penalty is only that they lose their immunity from being sued by a physician who they take action against as a peer review action for a 3-year period. Well, that's a very speculative penalty, and it's never been imposed and likely never will be. The other thing you could do conceivably is say, well, CMS, Medicare, Medicaid, could cut them off from participation in Medicare or in Medicaid. And that is such a drastic penalty. It's like going to nuclear war, it would drive a hospital out of business. And so it's just politically unfeasible to remove a hospital's participation in Medicare and Medicaid. It's not going to happen because it could be drastically harmful to patient care and in places where there's a limited number of hospitals or maybe only one. And, they're not in the business of driving hospitals out of business. So the penalties that we have are not effective and not practical.
Well, it makes me think of a traffic law. There are certain laws that are put in place for the public's safety. And, we don't have the option of deciding, well, I know that red kind of thing says STOP, but, and if I run the stop sign and kill somebody or maim them, destroy their lives, somebody's going to just say, oh, I wish you wouldn't have done that. And next time, would you please be sure to stop at the stop sign? I mean, it must be nice to be a hospital and be able to willfully ignore the law that is designed for patient safety and not have any ramifications.
Yeah, that's about the situation that exists. While I was at the data bank and running the research program, one of the things we tried to do was get hospitals to agree to let us come in and audit their peer review process to see how things were actually done and were things that should have been reported actually reported, or how did they get around reporting. And we told them that, we would give you total immunity from anything that was wrong, and we wouldn't go after you for anything we discovered. And just to do this, to try to get a handle on the problem and why it was a problem. And we could not get any hospital to agree to do that, to let us come in and look at the peer review process, even with these guarantees of immunity. So the hospitals don't really want a better system, I think, in terms of ensuring that reports are made.
Well, like I say, it's counterintuitive because it's like pass the hot potato. They don't want to report, but by the same token, they could get past a hot potato who could create a lot of civil liability for
Absolutely.
them. So it doesn't make any logical sense to me. But, I think what I think we have are hospitals who are pretty much allowed to go on the honor system and self-regulate. Is that
it's
fair?
essentially an honor system that they're going to do what the law says they should do. And if in severe cases they will, that they'll try to avoid it if they can. And there's two ways you can do that. One is to avoid taking an action which you or I or reasonable people would say ought to be taken against somebody in a given circumstance. And that's legal. Then there are the evasion situations where they say before an investigation starts, well, we'll investigate you for this, but you might want to resign before we start the investigation. Right. Or maybe they'll agree during an investigation, we'll terminate the investigation, without any action being taken if you agree to resign as soon as the investigation is completed and we've made this formal finding that we're not going to take any action. And that's simply evasion and is illegal under the law, but we know it happens.
Right. Well, we do know it happens, but we probably don't have a clue how often it really happens. Now, I mean, there's two sides to that. I know that the landmark study that you helped with at Public Citizen, hospitals dropped the ball on physician oversight, that was published 20 years ago or something like that.
Oh, yeah. That's where we get the data on what percent of hospitals have never reported. And it's about the same now as it was then.
Yeah, I wanted to mention that even though a new study hasn't been published since the original study, you have updated the data, and
yeah,
the needle hadn't really moved.
No, the needle has moved very slightly. And there are more physicians now than there were then. There are more hospitals now than there were then. But the percent that have reported has stayed about the same.
Right.
And, every physician or every medical school, somebody graduated at the bottom of the class. And just like in society as a whole, you have some people that are not competent in what they do, or maybe, are miscreant in how they behave. And you get a few of those in medicine as you get everywhere else. It's not that we are worried about the vast majority of physicians. The vast majority are competent, caring, don't have behavioral problems. But it's the very few that the data bank was designed to make sure couldn't continue to harm people, would give the tool to hospitals and licensors so that those very few could not continue to harm people. And yeah, it's working to an extent, but it's not working as well as it should. We found out in a survey, probably 10 years after the data bank opened, that 9% of the time that a hospital got a report from the data bank about a specific physician, they learned something new about that physician that they hadn't learned from any other source, including the physician's application. Well, there's absolutely nothing reported to the data bank that hospitals and licensing boards don't require physicians to put on their applications for licensure or clinical privileges. In fact, those applications typically require a lot more than the data bank has reported to it. For instance, typically they would ask for any pending malpractice payments or pending malpractice suits. Mm-hmm. And the data bank doesn't get that. But 9% of the time, these queryers at hospitals were learning something new that they hadn't learned anywhere else, including the application. Right. So that tells me that there was a lot of physicians that either had very bad memories or were actively trying not to reveal a problem in their past.
Well, there again, what's the punishment?
Yeah.
The
punishment can be, once the hospital finds out, if they then refuse to grant privileges to that physician on the basis that they weren't, clear and complete in their application, that is also reported to the data bank. So they can end up with more reports because they falsified an application.
Unless the hospital said, I'll tell you what, wink, wink, nod, nod, we sure don't want to cause any trouble for you, doctor, and why don't you just withdraw your application?
Well, if you withdraw your application in that circumstance, technically it's reportable. But if they can conclude that the application was never completely, wasn't completed totally when it was submitted, perhaps because they didn't include something that should have been included, then they never really started the peer review process because the application was incomplete, and that's not reportable.
Right. Well, one thing that I think it's important to point out is that there's not like a patient safety czar, like the airline industry has the FAA, the nuclear power industry has the the NRC?
The Regulatory Commission.
Yeah. But there's no agency that's spot checking to see if hospitals are complying with the law or not.
Right.
And
There's not.
so,
Nobody looks at how peer review is actually being performed or the results being reported.
so over the past decade or so, you and I and some other people who are going to be guests on this show, we're all trying to change the system. And I want you to talk about the fact that there was a big meeting of all the power players 25 years ago or whatever, and a consensus was reached that this was a problem and it needed to be fixed. Will you talk to us about that?
Yeah, the data bank really organized a meeting with a lot of the special interests involved, and this would be the American Hospital Association, the American Medical Association. We had law firms that specialized in medical law, and we had the CMS, the Office of Inspector General. All of us got together out in Chicago
Joint Commission.
for
Joint
a
Commission.
one-day meeting.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And the conclusion was, we're not getting the reports we should be getting for peer review. Clearly, there's a problem. And so the recommendation was that the data bank work with CMS, and then that CMS work with the Joint Commission on Accreditation, which was the accreditation agency at the time, to have an accreditation standard set for peer review processes and reporting peer review actions. And so that letter was sent, but the Joint Commission essentially said, well, we don't want to create a new standard that we have to review hospitals on to do that. And of course, now they're not the only accreditation agency around. Hospitals can choose what accreditor they want for participation in Medicare and Medicaid. And, you're going to choose the accreditation agency that is probably easiest to deal with and has maybe the lowest standards. So, it's sort of a race to the bottom, I think. And clearly the Joint Commission or other accreditation agencies do not want to step in and say, okay, we're going to start auditing peer review and reporting.
Well, again, it's kind of like focusing on the low-hanging fruit as well. Like, how many millions of dollars have been spent developing accreditation standards for things like catheter-associated urinary tract infections, central line associated bacterial infections, hospital falls. And yes, those are preventable and people are getting injured by those. But it's kind of like, why are we ignoring the 800-pound elephant that's sitting on our coffee table here? It's like nobody wants to touch it.
Well, I don't know if it's the 800-pound gorilla, but it's certainly something that nobody wants to touch. And the incentives are for hospitals and physicians are not to touch it, because it's expensive. It sets them up for legal liability, possibly, and it may drive revenue away from them. So the incentives are not to do it.
Well, we as patients rely on hospitals to conduct proper peer review and credentialing. And it's like, there, but for the grace of God, go I. Every time I'm, working with a client who has been the victim, they weren't expecting to be a victim. And, preventable medical errors aren't always discerning. They don't just pick Republicans or Democrats or liberals or conservatives or rich people or poor people, or, they're not discerning. But, what do you think it's going to take to change the system?
Well, the patient safety movement is extremely fragmented. It's not at the top of the list for most people. Most people assume that their physicians know what they're doing. And they're right. Most physicians do know what they're doing. Most hospitals are reasonably safe. So it's not the primary focus of people when they go to the voting booth. But what it's going to take is for people to say, this is really important, and I'm going to vote for people who will change the law in a meaningful way to require more safety in hospitals, more safety in medical licensing, better peer review, and so on. It's a matter of political will, and it needs to become more important to people. But, I think realistically, for most people, unless you've had an injury from a medical error, it's not going to be at the top of your list. I mean, we have tried to get legislators involved in changing laws in states, for instance. And the only ones we can get interested in doing something about it are the ones who have had medical errors that cause problems in their family or their extended family. Yeah. Otherwise, it's far from the top of somebody's list.
Well, you're absolutely right, and that's part of why I'm doing this podcast, is to educate people and inform them and try to rally a movement around this so that when people go to vote for politicians, they start asking questions like, where do you stand on these patient safety issues? And for politicians to understand that not only are they, their family, everybody they care about patients, but 100% of their constituents are patients. And that these issues matter to their voters. And politicians, being what they are, if they could be made to understand that their constituents care about these issues as much as they care about other issues, and they are voting in that way, my hope, and I know your hope, is that this will spark some change.
Yeah, patient safety issues are really a lot more important and a lot more likely to affect you personally than are a lot of the issues that we see brought up as hot button issues.
Right.
That really don't affect most people personally and never will.
That's exactly
but
right.
They're hot button. We can stir people up with this divisive issue. Well, I don't think patient safety is divisive, but it also doesn't rise to the top of the list for people.
Right. Yeah. And understandably so. I mean, there's a lot going on, and, oh, well, that doesn't affect me and probably won't ever affect me. Well, we hope not, but better to get ahead of it, right? To make sure that if
Absolutely.
you do.
That's what the data bank was designed to do, was to allow the people that make the decisions to keep patients safe, to allow them to have the information they need to do that. And you can bring the horse to water, but you can't make them drink. And that's part of the problem. They love to get the information, whether they act on it or not. But they don't want to have to provide the information if they can avoid it, because it's, the incentives are not to do that, not to drive physicians away.
Well, we need safe doctors and safe hospitals, the same
and
as
most of the time we have them.
Yep.
But it's the not always that's the problem.
That's right. That's exactly right. Well, Bob, I cannot thank you enough for taking your time to come talk to us today, and I hope to have you back as a future guest. We'll keep peeling the onion.
I'll be happy to come back and help however we can. I mean, the goal we all have is to make it safer for people to see physicians or other kinds of healthcare practitioners, make it safer for them in the hospital. Most of the time it's safe. Most of the time you get competent care, but it's those few exceptions that we want to reduce.
That's exactly right.
I think it's great that you're doing this to move us in the right direction.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. And I'm glad you brought that up, because there's no motive here to scare people. We don't want to scare people.
Oh,
we want people to get screenings. We want people to get the surgeries and the medical care that they need. But we also need to demand that our healthcare system is safe and reliable for everyone.
Right. You're safer going to get the care you need, even when there's a small risk, than you are in not getting the care you need.
Yeah.
And you're certainly safer finding out if you need care than then getting it if you do, than ignoring health problems. So,
Right.
yeah, we're not trying to scare people away. We're trying to make the system better. It's a reasonably safe system, but it's not as safe as it should be.
Right.
And there's the problem.
There's the problem, and we'll keep working on it until we can't work on it anymore, and then hopefully we'll pass the torch to some younger folks who will carry it on.
Right.
Well, Bob, I appreciate you so much. You know how much I like you and respect you, and I'm glad you're a part of my life, and I'm happy that we're doing our patient safety work together. I always learn from you, and I appreciate
Well, thank you very much, and I appreciate you having me on to talk about this.
Well, of course. All right. Well, I'll talk to you soon. Thank you so much.
Okay.